Here's a small list of some ideas of things that on the surface might not seem practical, but would probably make the world a better place. And kind of a compendium of ideas that mirror the kind of sentiments of my favorite comedian, George Carlin, that I've had in mind. And I don't know, it's just been this kind of like funny thought process of living in this world with so much kind of paradoxical showings of it being this place with this capacity for cruelty and yet such an emphasis on safety and togetherness and things like that, which I always found ironic. Usually you would see that as an indicator of somebody lying to you about the nature of the world around them. So I thought I'd give a couple suggestions and ideas to help facilitate this so-called safer world. My first thought in mind was instead of wasting billions of dollars on weapons manufacturing and arms, why not just make a competition out of war so people don't actually have to die? Why don't you just supply everybody with paintballs, or, you know, uh, airsofts, things like that? I guess somebody could still get hit in the eye, but I mean, if we have the materials to manufacture all the weapons and technology that we put into war, I think that we would have the same materials at our disposal to just make a bunch of Tipman, like paintball equipment and whatnot. And I've seen people build their own little mini bulldozer paintball tanks and things like that. So you could still have the fun with a little vehicle type deal. And the ironic thing is, it would probably take a lot of stress off people in those positions of having to deal with that. Probably take a lot of stress out of the soldiers. Yeah, you'd still have some arguments and things like that, but at least in that case and circumstance, you could have people kind of ref it. And yeah, nobody has to die or suffer life-threatening injuries in the case and point of that. Just some thoughts. I mean, if you wanted to get really extreme with it, I prefer a level of, there being a kind of risk reward in something like that if you were to turn it into just kind of giant game, considering war kind of is a game for people in positions of authority. Like, why not unilaterally spread that out so everybody can treat it the same way and doesn't have to, die for the sake of another person's ideological beliefs? You know, just saying. If you wanted to get it really safe, I guess you could make it a Nerf war. And then technically you could get the kids in on it. But I don't know. I think that's a little too soft a measure. It would be fun though. You could see a lot more people getting along with the concept of, taking out a little bit of a healthier dose of aggression without having to kill everybody. I think we all know around the world at this point in time, this day and age, that there are like alternatives to actually having to shoot people. And that kind of competitive sports like competition environment does make it a lot, funner, at least, without a whole lot of the gore and the despair that comes with war. You're probably wondering, well, what would we do with all the arms and the weaponry we've manufactured? I just want to point this out. It's a weird thing that planet Earth, aspires for things like traveling to other planets and things like this, yet we invest so much of our money and our resources into weaponry. at any given moment of time, too, uh, we have this vast quantity of debris and junk that very often we have a problem disposing of properly. We have a nasty habit of throwing things away and then ending up polluting bits and pieces of the planet. I just thought it more liable. Why don't we put that technology instead of putting it towards more, like ballistic or intercontinental ballistic missiles and nuclear weaponry, continuing manufacturing more weapons and things like that? Could just kind of build some kind of transport system and slowly over time work together to jettison that shit into space. That way it's not so big a problem, both weaponry and trash. A lot of people might get up in arms about that, no pun intended, about the idea of having their weapons kind of taken and like disposed of, and I can agree with that on some points. I'm not really for disarming the public, especially at a time like this in the world where things are a little bit helter-skelter. But they kind of have always been helter-skelter. And these are just hypothetical and kind of comedic suggestions, so not serious things. But the thought in mind that there is kind of an open vacuum of space that goes on infinitely in all directions. It kind of is, in a lot of ways, not necessarily a giant garbage can, but a giant recycling bin. And seeing as how we can't find the wherewithal and the courage to, agree to disagree and dismantle things like arms and nuclear weaponry and try to reassemble them into something actually practical and useful rather than just killing machines, I could see that being a solution, at least for a degree of getting rid of, excess garbage and things on the planet. Could just jettison it out to space. Same thing with nuclear warheads. There's not really the threat of people blowing up the planet if we just shoot really, really big fireworks into the vacuum of space. Although there is the problem of whether or not firing those off simultaneously would actually reach space, and one of those might not stray and hit a different country or continent. But I don't know. We always could find some kind of negotiation or agreement to transport those things out into space and just let go in the bygones be bygones and stop trying to blow one another up. A lot of people would raise a question or scrutinize and just warrant this statement. They would say, you must be either out of your fucking mind or a complete imbecile to think the people in positions of power and authority these days would ever consider these as options. There's too much at stake in the world. Oh, yeah, I'd agree. And I'm not being serious about these things. They're just practical suggestions and solutions that are possibilities, if you opened your mind to them. I mean, these things could be done, hypothetically. But I mean it more as a joke. About those leaders, you could solve the problem of the multi-spanning, multi-generational wars and conflicts in general if you just made a kind of like fighter pit for these leaders to fight in. Maybe throw in the people that, strongly support them in their little, private circles, but make it like WWE. Why not? It would solve the problem of, a lot of generations of people having to die for other people's ideas, to be drafted into war, all the unnecessary deaths, all the ideological conflicts that rise and stoke as a result of war and conflict, that sins of the father problem that we have so much. People dying and sacrificing for what they believe in, their countries, their principles, and men getting slaughtered in war, their children having to learn that a brother or cousin or a father or an uncle, sister even, was killed in combat, and then they too take on a mantle of ideological uh, despise and vengeance for the adversaries that caused that, even though circumstantially the same mechanisms were at play in the opposite country that pitted them and their relative against one another. You know, something similar might have been happening on the other side, completely unknown to them. Could save a lot of lives by just having the people in charge causing all these conflicts duke it out. I wouldn't mind seeing, you know, something like Xi Jinping versus the Pope, or Putin versus, I don't know, Keir Starmer. That would be a good one. That'd kind of be a Brock Lesnar v. Shane McMahon type scenario. A little bit interesting. Yeah, you could like theme it up and have it be, you know, gladiator style. Maybe give them some like soccer boppers, or those big ear cleaner type tube deals to just beat the shit out of each other with. And you can have them settle their differences in that way. It would be a lot more practical, a lot safer. It would put these people in a position where they have to kind of put their money where their mouth is, and you know, actively duke it out for their own standing principles rather than sending other people to do the dirty work for them. Another suggestion during all this, just another idea to make the world a kind of better, safer place. Maybe invest in a system that utilizes all this transportation that we have globally, the aircraft carriers and whatnot that's carrying all this military grade equipment. Maybe invest in some of that stuff instead of going to like naval destroyers and things like that globally in general. Invest in some ships that transport, you know, plant-based resources, seeds for fruits and vegetables, and equipment to build kind of interchangeable, maybe eco-friendly planters. I think at this point we're developing technology and kind of exploring what we can do with concrete and alternatives for building. It's always been a thought to me, you know, the climate of planet Earth produces biological organisms and the very things necessary for them to sustain life. It's an organic process. It more or less is just whatever grows out of the ground that can nourish life and sustain life. It's going to produce that seasonally. So the thought has always crossed my mind. We have these kind of artificial planters that grow all these trees and things like that. Why don't we have, you know, community vegetable gardens or planters that grow fruit trees on every street corner? You know, it would solve a lot of the hunger crisis going on in the world, the things that are artificially inflated by moneyed interests. And, you know, at the very least, people wouldn't have to starve in a way, in a sense. There could be plentiful ways to continuously grow and garden food and supplies for people. It would make the world kind of more unilaterally easier to navigate in a way if there was just an abundance of certain crops, certain fruits, certain vegetables growing everywhere. You know, we have the technology to plant these tropic trees and other things to make certain areas in the world seem like a paradise. And I know a lot of people use the excuse of global warming and climate change to really argue and kind of calculate and weigh and measure the cost effectiveness of such ideas, or they call it ludicrous and asinine. But I mean, there's a lot of things happening in the world that just don't make any sense that continue to happen. So I would see that endeavor kind of being a unilateral benefit to all humanity, regardless of, background or ideas or beliefs or tradition. It's something that we could all partake and share in, making the world, a kind of global garden in a lot of ways, taking all the advancements in technology that we have and using them actually to build the world in a better, more sustainable way rather than a destructive and kind of poisoning way, rather than rely and depend on factories that just make artificial, bogus shit that essentially poisons us and poisons the environment. Why don't we put an emphasis and a focus on using that technology, utilizing the materials at hand to, build a kind of world-spanning Zen garden in a lot of sense out of the planet? Because we could at any given time just start rapidly planting trees and growing fields. I think by now we could develop the ability to cultivate and find a formality of way to treat the soil, make sustainable, recyclable fertilizers, or find alternative routes to make certain barren areas more fertile. And we have the transportation available to do these things when they're not busy delivering, armaments and craft and weapons and bombs, things like that. Could find ways to convert all that weaponry into transportation to really farm and cultivate all the lands in the world in a more effective way. That way, they would actually create the sustaining, nourishing resources to make the world a more abundant place, to keep people healthy, and in turn, the world and civilization would probably be a whole lot better and more beneficial. Happy, healthy people often produce happy, healthy results and build a more happy, healthy, prosperous civilization, right? Well, it's weird. There's such an emphasis on kind of lobotomizing and drugging ourselves with things like caffeine and different pills and prescriptions and medications and things like that ironically come with more side effects than advantages at times. If everybody had the availability of proper nutrition and proper diet, and we were mass producing things through more like organic circumstance, more natural circumstance. I'm not saying like there isn't still going to be the problem and issue of like disease and things like that, but we can work on that. I'm sure somebody has solutions in that wheelhouse. These are just concepts and ideas that I thought would make the world a kind of safer, better place to live and thrive in. Just simple ideas. And whether or not they need to be taken seriously, that's up to interpretation. They're just some things that I kind of saw happening in the world that I always questioned and wondered about and was curious about, and thought, well, maybe just a solution of these couple things would help. Just a throw at the board, considering there's a lot of things circumstantially being thrown at the board that haven't worked or haven't been practical and don't make a lot of sense. There are just a couple suggestions.